Most people will spend their entire working lives believing that wealth begins with a larger income. It does not. The ancient household understood something that modern culture has almost entirely forgotten, that wealth does not begin with what arrives, but with what is permanently protected from spending. Solomon recorded this observation thousands of years ago, and it has never stopped being true. The $100 rule that quietly builds wealth over time is not about the amount. It is about the structure that the amount creates. Tell me in the comments, were you ever taught this about money? Two people, same company, same salary, same city. 10 years pass. One of them has quietly accumulated a financial foundation that no single expense can shake. The other earns the same amount they always have, spends what arrives, and waits, still waiting for the moment when things finally feel stable. Same income, different outcome. Most people look at that contrast and assume the first person made a smarter investment somewhere, or found an additional income stream, or received something the other did not. But when you study what actually separated them, the answer is almost never found in what they earned. It is found in what they kept. Not kept temporarily. Not kept until something came up. Kept permanently. Kept as though that portion of money had already left the household, except it hadn't left. It had simply stopped being available for spending. That distinction, small as it sounds, is the difference between financial fragility and financial structure. And understanding it requires that we step back from everything modern culture teaches about money. Because modern culture has this almost entirely wrong. Here is the dominant belief about wealth in the modern world. You are not yet in a position to save meaningfully. Your income is not quite high enough. Your expenses are too significant right now. But eventually, once the raise arrives, once the debt clears, once the circumstances improve, then you will begin building something. This belief feels reasonable. It sounds patient. It presents itself as responsible planning. It is in practice one of the most quietly destructive financial patterns a person can adopt, because the belief is built on a premise that never arrives. The raise comes, they expand to meet it. The new income level begins to feel like the minimum required to function, and the promise of future saving moves forward again, slightly out of reach, always approximately one income increase away. The salaried worker who earns $3,000 a month and spends $2,980 does not become the salaried worker who earns $4,500 and saves $1,500. He becomes the salaried worker who earns $4,500 and spends $4,480. The structure did not change. Only the numbers did. This is what behavioral economists now call lifestyle inflation, but it is not a modern discovery. It was observed and recorded thousands of years ago by people who understood wealth at a level that most modern financial thinking has never approached. The Book of Proverbs is one of the oldest and most studied collections of wisdom literature in human history. Traditionally associated with King Solomon, a figure whose wealth and intellectual legacy shaped the ancient world. These writings were not composed as motivational content. They were not designed to inspire or excite. They were recorded as structural observations, patterns that the disciplined household had proven true through repeated experience. Across generations, in the quiet accumulation of resources over time. One of the most important of these observations states that wealth gained hastily will diminish, but wealth gathered gradually, little by little, will increase. Read that again, slowly. Wealth gathered, little by little, increases. Not wealth seized quickly. Not wealth accumulated through extraordinary effort. Not wealth created by finding the right opportunity at the right moment. Wealth gathered. Little by little. The ancient household did not view this as a second-rate approach for people who lacked larger opportunities. They viewed it as the fundamental mechanism through which stable financial authority is built. The gradual accumulation was not the consolation prize. It was the method. And behind that method was a structural discipline that modern households have almost entirely abandoned. Here is the assumption that needs to be confronted directly. Most people believe that small savings are financially irrelevant, that reserving $50 or $100 or $200 per month accomplishes nothing meaningful, that the amount is simply too small to matter, that until a person can save a significant portion of their income, saving is essentially a symbolic gesture, something to feel good about without producing real results. This assumption sounds logical on the surface. It is incorrect at the structural level. Consider two individuals. Both earn $3,000 each month. Both have similar expenses. Both believe in the value of saving. They simply approach it differently. The first individual saves when convenient. Some months he manages $300. Other months, an unexpected expense appears and nothing is saved. Over 12 months, His savings are unpredictable. Some quarters are good, others produce nothing. The second individual reserves $100 at the beginning of every month. Before spending begins, without negotiation, without evaluating whether it feels manageable, $100. Every cycle, without exception, at the end of 12 months. The first individual may have saved more money in total in the months when circumstances align favorably, but he has built no structure. The second individual has built something that cannot be easily measured on a spreadsheet, a behavioral pattern, a repeating discipline, a monthly confirmation that he is the kind of person who protects a portion of what arrives. That difference, invisible in the short term, becomes the foundation of everything that follows. This is the mechanism, and it deserves to be named clearly. The $100 reserve rule. Before spending begins, a fixed amount is separated and protected. The number is modest by design. $100. Not because that is the ideal savings target, not because financial mathematics requires it, but because the rule must be able to survive repetition across every economic condition a person encounters. The rule must work in the difficult months. It must work in the months when other expenses crowd in. It must work in the months when the logical voice in a person's mind suggests that this one time, the circumstances justify an exception. The power of the rule does not come from the amount. The power comes from the permanence of the structure. Ancient households understood this intuitively. A merchant who reserved a portion of every transaction consistently, without renegotiation, was not building wealth through the size of any single reserve. He was building wealth through the unbroken accumulation of a repeating discipline. The $100 is not the wealth. The $100 is the proof that the structure exists. Now consider what most people do with money when it arrives. It enters the household. It is directed toward the most immediate obligations: rent, bills, groceries, debt, payments, transportation. Whatever remains, if anything remains, is then categorized as potentially available for saving. In this model, saving is positioned as the final step in a sequence. Earn, spend, then save whatever survives spending. The disciplined household reverses this sequence entirely. Earn, reserve, then spend. Whatever remains after the reserve is protected. The distinction appears almost trivially small. It is, in practice, the entire difference. When saving follows spending, it competes with every financial pressure that money produces. It loses to urgent expenses, it loses to small conveniences, it loses to the accumulated weight of ordinary life. When the reserve precedes spending, it does not compete with anything. It is removed from the arena before the competition begins. Spending must then adapt to what remains, because the reserve is no longer available. This reversal is the first structural layer of the mechanism. Reserve first, then spend from what remains. Most people read that sentence and agree with it immediately. Very few practice it without interruption. The reason consistent practice is rare is not financial. It is psychological. There is a quiet conversation that happens in a person's mind each month when a fixed reserve must be protected. The conversation sounds like reason. It presents itself as pragmatism. It says, this month is different. This month, there is more pressure. This month, the $100 would make a meaningful difference in how smoothly things move. Protect it next month. Next month, the conditions will be more favorable. This is not a financial argument. It is an identity argument, because the reserve is not protecting $100. It is protecting the identity of the person who does not negotiate with reserves. Disciplined families, the kind that quietly accumulate financial stability across decades, teach this to their households explicitly. The reserve is not a flexible budget category. It is not part of the spending conversation. It is untouchable capital, not because of its size, but because of what its protection confirms. Every time the reserve is protected, despite pressure, the household confirms its identity as a governing household rather than a spending household. Every time the reserve is compromised, the household returns to a spending-first identity, regardless of how reasonable the justification sounded. This is the identity shock that most financial thinking misses entirely. The $100 does not make a person wealthy. The decision to treat $100 as untouchable capital is the beginning of the psychology that eventually creates wealth. The ancient wisdom literature did not separate financial behavior from character. This was not an accident of culture. It was a structural observation. The same texts in Proverbs that describe gradual wealth accumulation also describe the person who governs their household with discipline, who maintains order, who protects resources, who does not allow short-term pressures to override long-term structure. Wealth, in this tradition, was never purely numerical. It was behavioral. It was the external expression of an internal order that the disciplined person had cultivated over time. When Solomon's writings described the patient accumulation of wealth, they were not simply giving financial advice. They were describing a certain kind of person, a person whose relationship with money was governed by structure rather than emotion, by patience rather than urgency, by long-term identity rather than short-term convenience. The $100 reserve rule is not a saving strategy in the modern sense of that phrase. It is a daily confirmation of who a person has chosen to become. This is where the mechanism becomes interesting, because on the surface, it looks simple. Reserve $100. Protect it. Repeat. But beneath that simplicity, something else is happening, something that most people who attempt this rule never fully recognize. Until they have practiced it long enough to observe the shift in themselves, the protection of a fixed reserve, repeated consistently across months and years, does not just accumulate money. It rewires the way a person perceives money. The individual who has never maintained an unbroken reserve structure sees money primarily as a flow. Money arrives. Money moves. Money is directed toward needs and desires. The balance rises and falls. This is the normal experience of money for most people. Dynamic, responsive, often stressful. The individual who has maintained a reserve structure for 12 months begins to see money differently. They begin to perceive a distinction, felt, not just understood, between money that moves and money that stays, between spending resources and capital, between what is available for the present moment and what belongs to a longer arc. This distinction cannot be created through understanding alone. It must be built through practice, through the repeated act of protecting the reserve when the pressure to spend it arrives, through the quiet accumulation of monthly confirmations that a portion of this household's resources does not move, regardless of what else moves around it. The ancient merchant who reserved a portion of every transaction eventually stopped experiencing the reserve as a sacrifice. He began experiencing spending without reserving as a structural error. The reserve became the default. The protection became the norm. That shift in perception, from "I am saving some of this" to "a portion of this was never available for spending," is the hidden lever that makes the mechanism work at a level that simple savings calculations cannot capture. But there is a deeper structural layer that still needs to be examined. One that most people who adopt this rule never reach because they run into a specific problem first. The problem is not discipline. Not exactly. The problem is what happens to the reserve when income increases. Because income does eventually increase for most people. A raise arrives, a better opportunity presents itself. A second income source develops. And in that moment, a decision is made, usually without conscious deliberation. That determines whether the reserve structure grows or whether it simply holds steady while the rest of the household expands around it. Most households choose expansion. The disciplined household makes a different decision in that moment, and the logic behind that decision reveals the second structural layer of the mechanism. The layer that separates the household that accumulates gradually from the household that accumulates once and stalls. That layer is what we will examine next, because the $100 rule is the beginning of the structure, but it is not the complete structure. And what remains to be understood changes how everything else in this framework functions. When income increases, most households celebrate. This is natural. An improvement in financial circumstances feels like progress, and in one sense, it is. More resources entering a household creates genuine new possibilities. But there is a moment, quiet, almost invisible, that arrives shortly after the income increases, a moment that most people pass through without recognizing its significance. It is the moment when the household decides what to do with the difference. The raise arrives. The additional income begins flowing in, and without deliberate intention, the household begins expanding to receive it. A slightly better apartment, a newer vehicle, more frequent meals outside the home, upgraded subscriptions, small conveniences that, individually, seem entirely reasonable. Each decision, taken alone, is justifiable. Together, they consume the increase entirely. 6 months after the raise, the household is spending more, but the reserve structure has not grown. The $100 remains $100, the same fixed amount it was when income was lower. The household has expanded everywhere except in the one category that determines long-term financial direction. This is not a failure of character. It is a failure of structure. The disciplined household understands something that the expanding household does not yet know. Lifestyle expansion is not a reward for earning more. It is the quiet mechanism that ensures earning more never translates into having more. Ancient households with genuine financial authority approached income increases with a specific sequence. Before any new spending category was considered, the reserve was increased first. not by an equal amount, not necessarily by a large amount, but by a deliberate, protected increment. If the reserve was $100 and the income increased by $500, the reserve did not remain $100. It moved first. Everything else moved second. If the remaining resources allowed it, this is the second structural layer of the mechanism. And it is the layer that separates slow, steady accumulation from the pattern where a person earns more for 20 years and arrives at the end of those 20 years with approximately the same financial foundation they had at the beginning. Protect the reserve. Then, when income grows, expand the reserve before expanding the lifestyle. Consider the practical reality of this over a decade. A household begins with $3,000 monthly income and a $100 reserve. The reserve is protected consistently. 12 months pass. The reserve has never been broken. The household has confirmed, through repetition, that this structure is non-negotiable. In the second year, income rises to $3,400. The household has $400 more per month available. The disciplined household moves the reserve to $150 immediately, before any lifestyle adjustment is considered. The additional $50 in the reserve is small, almost unnoticeable in the context of a $400 increase. But the message it sends to the household's financial psychology is significant. The message is, growth flows to the reserve first. Over 10 years, with consistent income progression and consistent reserve prioritization, the household that follows this sequence does not simply have more money saved than the household that expands lifestyle first. It has a fundamentally different relationship with money. The reserve is no longer an obligation. It is the first financial identity of the household, the thing that moves before anything else moves, the category that receives the first benefit of every improvement. That identity, practiced across a decade, produces a kind of financial calm that is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. It is not the excitement of a large windfall. It is quieter than that, more stable, more permanent. It is the feeling of a household that is not afraid of what next month will bring. This calm stability, this absence of financial anxiety, is something the ancient wisdom traditions spoke about directly. Proverbs describes the person of disciplined accumulation not primarily in terms of wealth, but in terms of security. The gradual gatherer does not fear sudden loss the way the hasty accumulator does. Because the structure that created the wealth is still intact, the discipline is still present. The reserve still moves first. If a setback arrives, and setbacks always eventually arrive, the disciplined household absorbs it differently. Not because the reserve is large enough to eliminate the setback, but because the reserve exists. And because the habit of protecting it has been practiced long enough that it survives even difficult periods. The undisciplined household, facing the same setback, has no reserve to absorb it. Every disruption reaches the full structure of the household immediately. There is no buffer. There is no protected category. Financial fragility is not the result of low income. Financial fragility is the result of a household that has never built a protected layer between income and spending. The reserve is that layer. Thin at first, gradually thickened, eventually structural. Now, we must address something that modern financial culture rarely discusses honestly. The $100 reserve rule does not produce dramatic results quickly. In the first month, it produces $100. In the first year, it produces $1,200, plus whatever has accumulated from consistent protection. These are not numbers that generate excitement. They do not look impressive on a financial statement. They do not produce the feeling of transformation that people often seek when they begin working on their financial lives. And this is precisely where most people abandon the structure. Not because they disagree with the principle, but because the early returns feel insufficient relative to the effort of consistent discipline. This is impatience, wearing the mask of logic. The ancient observation about wealth gathered little by little was not written to inspire patience as a virtue. It was written to describe a structural reality. Gradual accumulation, protected consistently, produces a compounding effect that is not visible in the early months. It becomes visible across years. The household that has protected a reserve for 3 years looks almost identical to the household that has not. From the outside, the numbers may not be dramatically different. The lifestyle may appear similar. But the internal structure has diverged completely. One household has spent 3 years training its financial behavior. 3 years of monthly confirmations that the reserve is non-negotiable. 3 years of learning to spend within what remains after the reserve is protected. 3 years of absorbing small setbacks without structural disruption. The other household has spent 3 years in the same pattern it began with. At year 5, the divergence begins to show more clearly. At year 10, it becomes undeniable. Not because the reserve itself has grown to a remarkable size, though it may have, but because the disciplined household has been making compounding behavioral decisions for a decade, each one building on the one before. Time favors the disciplined. Not because time is generous, but because time reveals structure. And structure, practiced consistently, produces what income alone never can. There is a social dimension to this that deserves quiet acknowledgement. The disciplined household rarely speaks about its reserves. This silence is not false modesty. It is not strategy. It is a natural reflection of the financial identity that the reserve structure creates. When money is governed rather than displayed, there is nothing to announce. The household is not performing wealth, it is practicing it. The contrast with the expanding household is often visible in social environments. The expanding household acquires visibly better possessions, newer technology, more frequent public consumption. The signals of financial improvement are outward and immediate. The disciplined household accumulates quietly, in the background of ordinary life, without external confirmation, without social performance. Ancient households understood this contrast deeply. The wisdom literature of Proverbs contains repeated observations about the person who appears wealthy, but has nothing, and the person who appears ordinary, but whose household rests on a foundation that does not shake. Quiet wealth moves slowly, but it moves deliberately, and it does not require an audience to continue moving. This is where the mechanism produces its most profound effect, and it is an effect that is entirely psychological. The person who has practiced the reserve discipline for long enough begins to experience a fundamental shift in how money feels. For most people, money is emotional. Its presence produces relief. Its absence produces anxiety. Financial decisions are made in response to these emotional states, spending when there is enough, contracting when there is not, always reactive, always responding to the current condition rather than building toward a longer one. The person who has maintained a reserve structure for years begins to move outside this emotional pattern, not because they are indifferent to money, but because the reserve has created a stable reference point, a fixed, protected quantity that exists independently of the month's pressures. A portion of the household's resources that does not participate in the emotional fluctuation of ordinary financial life. Income becomes raw material. It arrives, is processed through the structure, and is directed intentionally. Reserves become control. Not control over circumstances. Circumstances remain unpredictable, but control over the household's response to circumstances. Spending becomes deliberate rather than reactive. The question shifts from "can I afford this" to "does this belong in the structure I am building?" This is the psychological rewire that the $100 rule eventually produces. Not in the first month, not in the first year, but in the quiet accumulation of consistent practice over time. The person who reaches this point does not think about money the way they once did. Money is no longer something that happens to them. It is something they govern. To support this shift, the disciplined household practices a simple daily acknowledgement. Not a complex ritual, not an elaborate financial review, simply a regular, brief recognition that the reserve exists and remains protected. This acknowledgement does several things simultaneously. It reinforces the boundary between spending resources and reserved capital. It reminds the household that the structure is intact, and it gradually trains the mind to perceive the reserve as a permanent feature of financial life rather than a temporary accumulation waiting to be spent. Ancient households maintained this awareness through the physical practice of separated storage. Reserved resources were not kept where spending resources were kept. The physical separation reinforced the psychological boundary. In a modern context, the principle is the same, even if the mechanics differ. A separate account, a separate mental category, a regular acknowledgement that this portion exists and is not available for the spending conversation. Small practice, consistent repetition, deepening structure over time. A final word about the impatience that will inevitably arrive. It will come. It always does. There will be a month, perhaps several months, when the reserve feels too small to justify the discipline required to protect it. When a more exciting financial opportunity seems to demand that the reserve be redirected. When the slow accumulation feels like the wrong pace for a person with larger ambitions. In those moments, the ancient wisdom offers a clear and quiet correction. Wealth gained hastily diminishes. Not sometimes, not under certain conditions. It diminishes. The structure that produces lasting financial stability is not compatible with urgency. It does not accelerate on demand. It does not respond to impatience. It responds only to consistency. The $100 that has been protected for 5 years without interruption is not merely $100. It is the proof of a structure that has survived 60 consecutive months of pressure, convenience, and the recurring temptation to make an exception. That proof, that unbroken record of discipline, is more valuable than the number itself. Because the person who has protected a reserve for 60 months, without exception, has already become someone different. They have trained a financial identity that most people never develop. They have built the internal structure that ancient wisdom identified as the true origin of lasting wealth, not the income, not the opportunity, not the investment, the discipline, the structure, the quiet, repeated decision that a portion of what arrives will not leave. Wealth does not begin with a large number. It begins with a small, protected reserve that a person refuses to spend. It begins with the decision made once, then made again, every month. That money will be governed before it is spent. That structure will precede consumption. That patience will outlast urgency. The household that practices this for 1 year builds something modest. The household that practices it for 10 years builds something foundational. And the household that transmits this discipline to the next generation builds something that outlasts any single income, any single investment, any single financial decision. This is what the ancient wisdom of Proverbs was recording. Not a savings tip, not a budgeting method, a philosophy of financial identity. Wealth begins the moment a person decides that a portion of their resources will no longer be spent, that it will be reserved, protected, governed, not tomorrow. Not when the income is higher, not when the circumstances improve. Now, with whatever arrives, starting with the next $100. If this perspective changed how you think about money, the next video continues this framework, exploring the ancient principle that separates households that accumulate from households that merely earn. Consider subscribing so that video reaches you when it releases.